Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Making Milestones podcast. What is this? Is this now I think maybe 3 weeks in a row that I'm uploading on the same day? That is absolutely wild. I think I deserve a round of applause for that because that is quite the feat. If you look back on the traditional history of how I've uploaded these podcast episodes and just how erratic it has been, this is a first. Anyways, you're probably looking at the title of this podcast and you're going, what the heck? Aren't you a horse trainer? That seems like a pretty silly and maybe perhaps hypocritical thing to be remarking on in this podcast episode, but just stick with me because I think that this is a very important topic. First, I just wanted to quickly thank everyone because the podcast has seen a pretty significant growth in viewership and the amount of podcast episodes being downloaded. So I really appreciate that. To everyone who has reviewed my podcast on whatever podcast provider you listen on, that helps a lot. It helps get my podcast suggested and recommended to people more. So I massively appreciate that. So thank you, everyone. And without further ado, let's just jump right into the topic. Why you shouldn't be a horse trainer. The title of this is a little facetious. The purpose of it is to kind of go over some of the challenges that people face as horse trainers and to bring them to light so that hopefully anyone who is hoping for that as a career path goes into it a little bit more prepared, or perhaps tweaks the way that they go about things so that they're not going to impact their mental health or their morals, because I think that this is just an underrepresented topic where we oftentimes go into the idea of being a horse trainer with this grand idea that you're just playing with horses all day and that it's not going to feel like work because you're doing what you love. And I'm here to say that that's not true. Anytime you turn something into a job, it's not just fun and games anymore. Part of the reason why riding horses just for fun is so fun and enjoyable is because there is a complete absence of pressure in comparison to when you're doing it for a career. When it's your career, you're relying on it to pay rent, you're relying on it to pay your bills, and you're also answering to clients. So it completely changes the dynamic of it. And I just think it's an entirely false narrative that we have a decent portion of the equestrian community and also just the human society as a general rule where they're oh, if you love the job that you do, you won't work a day in your life. That is not true. Loving your job does not mean it's just going to feel like you are playing games all day. You can love your job and it can be the best choice for you in terms of when you're selecting a job, that this is the job that you're happiest doing. Those things can be true, but it's still work. And I think that is a really clear takeaway. And horse training and working in the horse industry in general, I think is a pretty unique dynamic because first of all, let's look at grooms and stable workers, etc. It's relatively normal in this industry for people to not be paid fairly for the work that they're doing. Even when they're making minimum wage, in my opinion, that's not enough for grooms and stable hands because it's really hard physical labor. It's hard on your body. It wears your body down. And on top of that, it's also dangerous. A lot of these people are working with horses who are difficult to handle and who are not safe. So they are at risk of injury. And on top of that risk of injury, they do not have hazard pay. So if you get injured and you can't show up to work the next day, even if it's a relatively minor injury that's only going to take you out of work for 3 days, you're still losing 3 days of pay and you're not getting that from anywhere. And if you were being paid more than minimum wage, it would allow for more opportunity perhaps to save and prepare for those types of moments because horses are highly dangerous. That's one of the things that when people are trying to flex equestrian sports and TikTok videos and stuff, the danger of it is something that is glorified and remarked on all the time. So people are well aware of the fact that this sport is dangerous, that handling horses is dangerous. I can't remember an exact statistic right now, but a huge portion of injuries to people around horses actually occur on the ground. So for these jobs where people aren't even training the horses, they're still highly dangerous. And honestly, in some ways, it's worse because at least if you're being paid to train the horse, you have a little bit more control over how the horse is being handled and you have a little bit more sway to talk to the owner and request certain changes to management that may influence the horse's behavior. Grooms and stable hands don't have that. They get paid like shit. They're underappreciated and they don't have any hazard pay. So that's just like one example of this weird dynamic in the horse world where it's like accepted to pay people unfairly. Like I've even seen certain barns offering piece work that works out to be under a minimum wage. So it is literally illegal. And I've seen people call them out on this in equestrian groups, only to have like other people stand up for them and be like, oh, well, if they don't want the job, they don't have to take it. And I hate that attitude because it's also not taking into the account that like right now, like the cost of living is so high that people are barely being able to afford rent. Like most of the people in my generation can't freaking afford to save basically anything. Like the idea of ever purchasing a house is like a pipe dream. And so to say like, oh, if they don't want to work the job, they don't need to. Like one thing I think that is really important to note is that when you're working in the horse world specifically, it requires a lot of very highly specialized skill sets that aren't necessarily super useful for other industries. So if you cannot find a job within this industry, you have to go looking elsewhere, and it's not always going to result in you getting paid fairly or being able to find a job in the first place. So there is a lot of pressure to just stay in the horse world because of that. And that's not something that's taken into account enough. So regardless, like people deserve to be paid fairly. Like even if they're taking the job, that doesn't mean that it's okay to take advantage of them just because they accepted the job. And recently there was an article in, I think it was Horse and Hound, about the challenges that boarding facility owners are facing with rising costs, which is valid. This isn't to take away from the fact that that is a struggle, but it centered boarding facility owners when it was discussing the raising minimum wage in the UK and the struggles the boarding facility owners face, rather than the struggles of people who are getting paid minimum wage to do a physically laborious job that requires specialized skill sets and also is dangerous, and also how those minimum wages aren't even necessarily enough to actually make a fair living in the areas that they're residing in. So it centered the people who, in order to operate and run a boarding facility, you're doing well enough to at least be able to rent a pretty large facility. In a lot of cases, own your own property, and you're choosing to do so in the same way that like they use the excuse of like, oh, they're choosing to get this job. If they didn't want to get paid this shitty wage, they wouldn't take it. But even more so, like in my eyes, like if I ever buy a property, I am never going to run a boarding facility. My friends can board with me. People I like can board with me. People who are in training programs can board with me. And I'll take like very select clients and do like behavior modification programs, clinics, temporary boarding. But I will not run and function as a regular boarding facility because of how little the income that you're actually getting is, how much of a pain in the ass it is, how much wear and tear your property takes, how annoying some boarders can be to deal with, and just the general challenges that you're facing versus the rewards that you're getting in return. I personally wouldn't do that, but that's like a separate story. We're here to talk about horse trainers. I just wanted to bring up the jobs that are hard labor that are usually underappreciated and also very underpaid, just to provide further reference for the fact that there is a certain standard of like expectation that people should just work for a little pay and that they should endanger themselves for you simply because they're being paid. And that crosses over into horse training. People don't really care about your safety as a horse trainer. Like that's a generalization because some clients care deeply, and that's great. But a lot of people will happily lie to you about where their horse is at in training just to get you to get on it. They'll want you to get on it and ride it right away and not do groundwork because there's this mindset that groundwork isn't as useful and they shouldn't be having to pay as much. And then if you're doing like days or weeks of groundwork, that you're wasting their money, which is completely false. And also in my eyes, if you're not willing to get on your own horse and ride them and you are outsourcing the problem for someone else to fix it, then you shouldn't really be calling the shots on how they endanger their body in terms of like when they should be taking the next step. Or if you have a problem with it, it's like, find a different trainer. But there's a reason why people take the time that they do to train certain behaviors. But anyways, there's a huge lack of appreciation for the safety risk for trainers as well. I've had people that I've known for long periods of time, like people who I grew up riding with, that have put me in physically compromising positions that have permanently damaged my body. because they misled me on how much training their horse had. And this isn't to fully blame them, because it's also to blame myself, because I shouldn't just be taking people's word for things like that. This was several years ago now, but I'm so lucky I didn't break my back. And it was like a bad accident where the horse, I was told, was broke and was doing really well and like was coming back into work, and they didn't want me to do very many groundwork days. So I did like, I think 2 or 3 groundwork days beforehand, and the horse seemed fine with the saddle on, and I was like assured that this horse is well broke. So I just got on it, and the horse took one step forward off of the mounting block and just threw his head down and freaking exploded into a bronc fit and rocket launched me so hard into the ground that I like left a crater with my hip. And it's the first and only time that I've had a fall where like I started to get up, and then I felt like I was going to vomit because the pain was so bad, and I had to take a knee and not get all the way up. And that's the only time that has ever happened to me. And then the horse proceeded to gallop around the arena, bronking until he got the entire saddle with the girth still attached from both sides all the way over his head, and successfully like got rid of the entire tack. At which point, like, the owner was far more concerned about what the horse is doing. And like, again, like, I get that you want to keep your horse safe, but we were in an enclosed arena. Yes, he was bronching. The stirrups were not like a danger risk for him. The reins were still over top of his head. Like, she could see that I was very clearly hurt, and she did not check on me until like after checking the horse. And even at that point, like, the amount of checking that she did was very like haphazardly. And it was very much downplaying like the injury that I had sustained and just not showing a lot of care. And that was pretty eye-opening to me, because it wasn't just like any regular client. It was someone who had known me since I was a child. And seeing that type of reaction towards my safety, it started to the slow shift of like how I go about things as a trainer, because that was long enough ago that like I was doing things now that I think were stupid and unnecessarily risk taking when it comes to training. But that's just like one example of an instance where my safety has been endangered, and the person who was hiring me really did not care. Like, they didn't care about the danger that they put me in. That's also happened to me like a lot when I was working at the racetrack, not with like my one boss who I worked for the longest. She was great, and she also took safety very seriously. But when I was working in town at the public racetrack, there was a situation where I had told the owner of the horse, I was like, his saddle keeps slipping. Like, I need you to put like a half pad, like a no slip pad underneath the tack, or like a breastplate or something. And then he was like, oh yeah, I'll do a no slip pad. So since it goes underneath the saddle pad against the horse, I didn't see that it wasn't on, and I just took his word for it. And then sure enough, the saddle slipped while I was working the horse, and the saddle, or no, sorry, the saddle slipped while I was working a horse prior to me saying that. But on this other horse, it was a regular training day where we were just doing like a normal exercise, not like a timed work. And the horse that it slipped on, like, was having a really hard day, and he reared straight up on me when we got on the track and almost flipped over on me. And then like it's because he wanted to get moving, and I was holding him back initially. And then once he got moving, he settled a little bit more, but the saddle started to slide back heavily. And when you're galloping racehorses, you're pushing back against the stirrups to use like your hips, and like the stirrups is like a fulcrum to help like check the horse back and bring them back when they're getting too fast. So I was like half halting like that and using my seat, so it pushes the saddle around when it slips. So the girth and the saddle had slipped to the point where like his pads slips completely out from underneath of them. And then I just had a saddle that had now lost like probably 3 inches of padding. So the girth was like not done up basically, right? And I'm on this horse who's not safe. We're heading down towards the back corner, and if he goes through the back corner, then you're coming down the wire, and they naturally speed up at that point. So I was like, if I don't pull up before this back corner, I am fucked. Like, I'm going to get like a mortal injury. Like, I'm so screwed. Luckily, I did get him pulled up. The outrider at the track came and like saved my life. Shout out to Darcy. And like, so that was like, I ended up being fine. But the owner then blamed me, and he's like, you should have done up the girth tighter. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to over tighten the girth to the point where your horse cannot fully expand his fucking rib cage to breathe, something that is very crucial for exercising as a racehorse, because you can't freaking get either a saddle that fits better, a breastplate, a no slip pad, or like all of the above, right? But no, he blamed me and was just talking shit all over the racetrack. Darcy got the saddle pads off the track and allegedly threw them into like a blackberry bush, like a huge black, like think of like the brambles. I think it's the Land Before Time or something. There's like an area where there's all these brambles and it's like a maze of brambles and like there's like a T-Rex and shit like out there and they're like hiding in the brambles. It was like that, like densely wooded, like blackberry brambles. And he threw the pads over the side of the track into the brambles apparently, and then the trainer was quite pissed off about that, but it was kind of like a fuck you to the trainer, I think, because like he endangered me, like, and I could have been so hurt, like it could have killed me. So those are just a few examples of like my bodily risk that I take to ride people's horses not being taken seriously. And it's like, yes, when you're choosing to train horses and work with horses in general, you are naturally taking on a level of risk that you like are aware of. But that does not mean that clients and employers can just make that risk worse than it has to be and have no care for you. Like you're already doing something that's dangerous in the best of circumstances. People not giving a shit and trying to endanger you more is not okay. So one of the issues with being a horse trainer is that people feel entitled to endangering your body. And if you don't really speak up for yourself, they're going to take advantage of that. And even if you really do speak up for yourself, they're going to try to take advantage of that to the point where you're probably going to find yourself in positions where you need to just fire your clients and be like, I'm not going to work for you. This is unsafe. You are endangering me and you're not taking what I say seriously. And when you're starting out as a horse trainer, that's very hard to do because you need clients. You're building your reputation. Some of the people that you're working for might be more known in the industry than you are. And if they decide to go run around talking shit about you, it could damage your career and it could damage your ability to pay for your life. So you're put in this position where you feel trapped and where you feel like at the mercy of these people who are taking advantage of you. And you have to, in a lot of ways, you feel like you have to like compromise to an extent where you have to find a way to keep them happy without fully endangering yourselves. And that is a real struggle. It's something that I think needs to be discussed more because like that's just one layer of all of this. That's not even factoring in like how clients will pressure you to move their horses along faster than you should because they'll want you to be jumping them sooner. They'll want them to be getting like a 30-day start and be going walk, trot, canter and out on trails by the end of that. And they'll be pressuring you to fulfill these timelines that like even if the horse can mentally do it without killing you, it's not physically fair to the horse. And you're in this position where you feel like you have to do these things in order to put food on your table and take care of yourself. And so it leads you into scenarios where you have to choose your morals and your value system or getting paid. And with reasonable clients, you can say what you mean and be like, I don't think this horse is ready to move along this quickly. That's not reasonable. Like a 30-day start isn't particularly reasonable because a horse can't go from never having packed weight before to carrying a rider around at all gates and being ridden for long periods of time. Like there's no one on this planet who just decides to start doing a sport and then is doing it basically at full intensity by 30 days end. That's not how things work. And reasonable clients will be like, okay, yes, I understand. They might ask you for further clarification, but they're on board with that because they just want their horse to be happy and they want you to do it properly. But a lot of unreasonable clients, which are lots of them, because keep in mind that you can find a ton of trainers who are willing to sell this idea to them, that this is possible, that this is fair and justifiable to do to the horse. So they'll pressure you and they might even threaten to be like, oh, well, like lots of other trainers are willing to do it. So if you're not willing to do it, then I'll find someone who will. And they might even put in their little comments that are made to like degrade your expertise as a trainer and be like, oh, well, maybe you're just not like good enough, or maybe you're just not experienced enough yet. Like you're pretty green, you're new to this or whatever. They'll use little digs and it's kind of like gaslighty, like manipulation tactics where they're trying to get you to do what they want. And they're saying things that they know will work to get you to respond and do what they want. And it's this really fucked up dynamic because like, you're the one who's putting yourself at risk. And in theory, it's like, yes, you're in control when you're the one on the horse and handling the horse. But when they're writing your paycheck, you're at the mercy of them in a lot of ways. And it can feel really trapping where like you know that things aren't going the way that they should be. You know that it's not fully fair to the horse and that it's not the way that you want to do things or the way that you're fully comfortable with, but you're trying to find these compromises in order to appease a client who's not being reasonable. And this is the reality of being a horse trainer. I know there's people who are going to come on here and go like, I've never had to do that ever, who are horse trainers. One, I think a lot of them are actually lying to themselves, and that there's at least one instance where they have done something that they're not fully comfortable with. Because, like, let's be for real, in any situation, unless you're like a very unusual person, most of us have not grown up advocating for ourselves so completely that we've never been pressured into doing something that we didn't want to do or that we weren't comfortable with, especially by someone who's older than us or seemingly more experienced in XYZ way. And so I think that a lot of people are being a little bit idealistic and are kind of being like not being fully genuine with themselves when they say that. But like, sure, there might be a few people who haven't, but honestly, like most trainers have been in a position where they have not been fully comfortable with something and where they've been pressured into doing something that they're not wanting to do. Because also keep in mind, a lot of trainers start out being mentored by other trainers and working underneath other trainers who they are at the mercy of those trainers' policies because they're working within those barns with clients that that trainer has sourced and given to them. And that is how a lot of people start out. And also a lot of us are kind of brainwashed by the entire horse community into thinking that certain aspects of horse training are okay and normal, and that it's just like a normal part of having green horses to have them freaking out all the time, and that starting horses at 3 years old and having them riding pretty heavily in their 3-year-old year is totally normal. We are conditioned to think that these things are okay. And people who believe that they're okay are a dime a dozen. They're everywhere. So it's just a very ingrained and entrenched attitude. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find any trainer who's actually at the point in their life where they are being honest with themselves that would not tell you that there have been situations where they've been pressured into doing things that they didn't want to do, that they didn't feel were safe, and that put them at unnecessary risk, because most of us have been. And that's the reality of it. Even with clients who start out being like, I just want you to go at my horse's pace. Like, I just want you to like keep them happy and make sure they're enjoying their job and like just keep like I want them to feel good about things. You'll got clients like that and you'll be like, hallelujah, this is so great. I'm so excited that I have someone who's actually viewing things this way. And then like time will pass and they might hit a point where they feel like you're not moving fast enough, and then all of a sudden they're piling on this pressure that they had told you would never be there from the beginning. And then you're just like, okay, like what the heck? And now you're in a position where you have been working for this person for a little bit of time. You built a relationship with the horses, and now they're changing the parameters of the agreement that you had. And if they're a reasonable client, you can bring this up to them and just be like, I'm doing what you said. Like, I'm keeping the horse in mind and I'm just going at their pace and this is what I'm doing. And they'll be like, okay, yeah. And then they might be like, okay, like, do you think it's reasonable for them to hit this milestone within this span of time? And you can either say yes or no. And there's like communication and dialogue, and that's how it should be. But if they're not a reasonable client, they'll start to show you signs that they're not appeased with the way that you're doing things. And then you meet this pressure. And then it can start to create these situations where you actually dread going to work. You don't want to go work with certain horses because the horse, you might really like the horse, but you're having to push them too quickly. Or you're working with horses who are really difficult and dangerous, and you dread going to work because you know that every time you go there, that it is a risk to your safety. And it starts to really rob you of the joy of having horses around. And like the other thing too is if you have horses of your own, or if you're leasing, or if you're doing lessons or whatever, and you have these horses that you enjoy riding, when you're riding like anywhere from 5 to 20 horses a day, depending on if you're doing like regular training within a barn or if you're doing track work with race horses, you're so physically exhausted by the end of that and like burnt out mentally as well that you do not enjoy riding your horses as much. Unless you're a very unique type of person, or in the early stages of your career, you might be able to manage this, but at some point you're going to burn out because of the physical intensity, how sore your body's going to get, how burnt out you are from dealing with clients who are being difficult, how burnt out you are from dealing with horses who have issues that the client's not dealing with. Another recently-ish example I have of this is that I was doing groundwork with a horse who is really quite dangerous. This was within like the last 2 years. I'm not going to give an exact date just in case the people who own the horse are listening. But the horse is really dangerous and like would be like rearing, kicking out, and just like super, super worked up all the time on the ground and like kicking out at you and stuff if he got far enough away. And the primary issue with this horse was the fact that he was not getting enough turnout and that it was a young horse who needed more exercise and needed more enrichment. But the turnout issue was not being dealt with at the facility the horse was boarded at. So basically, I'm being paid to be a freaking band-aid because yes, there can be some changes to the behavior that make the horse slightly more manageable, but the primary issue is that he's not getting enough turnout. So those issues are going to remain until that is addressed. And you can bring this up, which obviously I do, but oftentimes the owner doesn't want to move because they have friends at that barn. It's close by to their house and there's like conveniences that they like, or like a lot of people who've grown up in the typical boarding barn facilities where it's just like stall to paddock. The idea of having their horse out in the rain where it could get a little bit muddy in the field and where they might be out with other horses and where they can actually go running around, especially when they're already this worked up and like quote unquote crazy. I don't mean that as in I think the horse is crazy. That's how people interpret their behavior, right? So when you turn horses like that out for the first time, they're going to go ripping around and they're going to go galloping around. And a lot of people get scared watching that and they're afraid of the risk of injury because that seems like a far more real risk when you're actually watching it happen like that. When in reality, the more real risk is when you have a horse who's confined a lot and then all of a sudden you're like turning them out in the arena to free lunge or they get loose from you, God forbid. And then they're running around blindly and dangerously, and they're doing that on a far more repeated basis. And they're also doing more of it because they're not getting enough exercise. A properly turned out horse, the first time you turn them out, probably going to run around quite a lot. But over time, it's going to become much more short-lived. They might still go have fun with their friends occasionally, but it's not very often. It's not high intensity, and it's not going to be for as long. And also, they've gotten used to having the space to move and do that. So they're less erratic in their behavior. It's more controlled and they're less likely to get injured because they've also built up to it. They're not just going from being in a 12 by 12 stall overnight to suddenly going outside and then running down like a 50-foot paddock, slamming on the brakes the other end, spinning and running around the other way. But it's the human perception of what they feel as more dangerous. So anyways, there's also a lot of cases like that where like the client might not even be being difficult per se, but if they're not willing to change the most vital contribution to their horse's unwanted behavior, you're essentially a glorified band-aid who's having to go there day after day and work with a horse who's far more difficult than they need to be. And you as the trainer are well aware of this. And you're just there endangering yourself, feeling like you're not really making that much of a difference because the actual causes of the behavior are not being addressed. And it's very frustrating and it's demoralizing. Like, I think that's the other layer of like horse training is that there's a lot of demoralization where you're only so able to help the horses. You can only help them with the access that the owner is willing to give you and with the resources the owner has to offer. Like, you're only able to help the horse within the confines of the space provided. And it can be really hopeless, especially when the owner views the behaviors of the horse as like crazy or bad, or says the horse is just being a dick. And like the barn people, like the employees and the staff don't like the horse because they're difficult. And believe me, like I get that because again, they're getting paid like shit and they're having to handle horses who are dangerous. So I get that. And I get why you dislike horses, because that's the other layer of this with like the horse training thing as well, is when you feel trapped and you can't make meaningful change to the horse's behavior to actually make them much, much safer to handle. It's really easy to get burnt out, jaded, and bitter. And that's what we have a horse industry full of people like that. People who have been pressured into handling horses who are exceptionally dangerous, who they ultimately cannot make major changes to the horse's behavior because usually it's like a management or lifestyle shift that needs to happen. So they're handling these dangerous horses and they can't really make a meaningful difference because the factors that are creating the horse the horse's dangerous behavior aren't being addressed. And so then you are more likely to be pulled into using like nose chains, lip chains, harsher bits, things that help you gag the behavior enough to make the horse feel slightly safer in those moments and make the behavior maybe a little bit less explosive, but they certainly don't stop it from perpetually reoccurring. And they're, again, a band-aid, and they're more likely to stress the horse. And it can also create this rebound effect where it's like the horse is having their stress gagged so much that one day they might have an extra big explosion that's even more dangerous. So it's not fixing the problem. It's at the horse's expense. It's not good for their welfare. The horse isn't happy. You aren't happy. Deep down, you know, using these tools is wrong. You're not comfortable with it. You see people doing things to horses that you're not comfortable with, that you know are unkind. But you're trapped in this toxic environment where everyone is self-enabling. They're enabling you. They've become complacent with the horse's behavior. They don't really see how they can fix it through management changes. And you're just in the middle of all of this. So then it leads you to the point where your options are either to quit the job and find a place that is less toxic, or to become part of the problem, ignore the issues within that management style, become complacent and apathetic like everyone else, and just continue to create that repeated issue that we see across the horse world. And this is also why you see people go so heavily into denial and get so angry when people are more critical of harsh equipment, or when they're more critical of horses exhibiting signs of stress, and like pointing out the fact that it's stress related, because people want to look at these things on a very surface level basis where it's just like, oh, he's just being a dick. Oh, he's just a spirited young sport horse. Oh, he's just this or that, because they don't have to look at things as deeply then, and they can feel like they are doing their part more than they might actually be. Especially when you have a barn full of people who are willing to do the same thing and who are willing to give you a pat on the back and reaffirm those perspectives time after time. When you have outside people who are saying things that are calling for you to think more deeply about why these behaviors exist, it's very frustrating, and it can make you very angry because you already feel trapped and limited within the environment that you're in. And this is what we see happening to tons of trainers. They feel burnt out. They feel hopeless. They probably have some degree of internalized guilt about the way that they've been going about training horses. And when that's exposed and brought about by other people, it's a very, very uncomfortable existence. And you get lots and lots of anger. And also when you feel trapped and you're having to handle these dangerous horses all the time, and you've already worked with like 5 horses that day and they've all been giving you a hard time, and you're tired, you might have a headache, you might even be a little bit sick, because let's be for real, like you're going to work sick most of the time, because sick days aren't really a thing in the horse industry. So you're having a bad day, and then your last horse gives you a really hard time, and you're trigger stacked, and it's really easy to snap and then take it out on the horse and do things that are not productive, that are just about dominating the horse and controlling them through fear and really getting after them. And again, like every video you see of trainers where they're freaking doing stuff like this, where they're chasing the horse around the arena backwards, and the horse is backing up trying to get away from them, and they're swinging the rope at them, and they're yelling, and they've clearly lost their patience. Regardless of their training philosophy, I think this is a great example of trigger stacking on the part of the human, where they have lost their cool, they've lost the plot. And for people who've normalized those types of training tactics, it's easier to get to that point for sure, because they're justifying and enabling it. But even for those who don't usually do that, it's like this buildup of like feeling trapped, feeling stuck, having all of this pressure for like what your clients are expecting from you, for what you're expecting from yourself, for what the industry expects and what they paint as normal for horse development. And then also all the other factors that might be contributing to the horse's problem behavior, having a bad day, you feeling not physically well, you maybe being in a little bit of pain, you having to deal with like other horses who are difficult, and then having that all come to a head where you lose your patience, and it comes out in your training style. And again, this is something that I think most trainers who are being honest with themselves can attest to having done. There might be a few outliers out there who can actually say that they haven't done, but I would wager that the trainers who haven't are probably people who've dealt with these aspects of toxic horsemanship and the way that they approach horse training, that they've dealt with all of that and kind of gone through that process before ever offering public services, because then you're in a different philosophy. If I started out training professionally, like right now, after having this big shift in my perspective, it would go a lot differently, and there wouldn't be the same level of justifications or like trigger stacking where I get reactive towards the horse because of other stressors, right? So It's definitely different, but most people can attest to that because it can also just be like if you're dealing with like trauma and family life stuff, like it makes it a lot easier to be trigger stacked, especially if you're then going from there into another toxic environment within the barn. So, being a horse trainer is like really physically taxing. Obviously, it's dangerous to your body, it's hard on your body, even on a good day. But it's also really mentally taxing because there's a lot of like manipulative tactics that are used in the horse world. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of social pressure from friends. There is pressure to look a certain way on social media and to present yourself a certain way, to wear the right clothes, to wear the right brands, to be competing and having a show record so that you can prove that you know what you're doing. And all of this stuff, a lot of it is like really elitist as well. So, especially if you're coming from a place where you aren't coming from money, that can be a frick ton of pressure because you're coming from a place where you feel like you have to work even harder to prove yourself. And it honestly is not a super healthy environment, especially when you're starting out and trying to prove yourself initially. Like, it was so toxic. It was so hard on my mental health. I hit times where I was like, literally sitting in bed and I did not want to get up. I did not want to go to work. And I was like at the cusp of like freaking out where like the tiniest little shred of something could come and like derail my day and I would just lose my shit, where I would just be literally having like an adult temper tantrum. And I would be freaking out and like basically not getting mad at the people around me, but going off about how shit everything was and how much I hated everything, and like that I didn't even enjoy working with horses anymore, and that I hated my job and stuff. And honestly, for a while there, it did rob me of the joy of riding. Like, I never rode my own horses when I was at my busiest. And I hit the point where I was like, why the fuck am I doing this? Like, I got into this because I love working with horses, but I don't even get to work with my own horses. And I'm miserable. I'm tired. I'm cranky. I'm not getting enough sleep. All I'm doing every day is hard physical labor. And by the time I finish doing what I'm doing, I only have time to just do chores with my horses where I'm feeding them or cleaning their paddock or whatever. I don't have time for anything. And I was like, why am I doing this? This sucks. And it kind of hit a point where I was like, okay, I need to like rebrand what I'm doing. And like, that's also partly why I've started to lay into doing more of like the shop stuff and that sort of thing. And also like online stuff, because like I couldn't do it anymore. Like, I couldn't maintain the client load that I needed in order to be able to pay for stuff and still get to enjoy my own horses. And I was like, what is the point? I'm paying for these horses who are just sitting in my yard, who I don't even get to sit with and relax and chill with. And like, it's not even about riding. Like, I couldn't even take a breather in a moment to just enjoy being around them because I was too freaking busy. And it was stupid. So then I hit a point where I cut back my client load immensely, and I started to be way more choosy and picky about what clients I would take on. And on the outside, like, I've had people try to use it as like a lack of success now, that it's like, oh, like, you don't even train anymore. And it's like, well, no, I still do, but I've cut it back so much because I literally wanted to just like no longer exist. Like, I was not having a good time. I was fucking miserable and it was just too much, and I couldn't even enjoy my own horses. And also, like, in order to maintain it at the rate that I was and be training as many horses as I was, I couldn't do things fully in the way that I wanted to, because also the type of clientele I was initially attracting were a lot of the people who wanted things to move along quicker, and I couldn't fully embrace like the philosophy that I really wanted to have. So I've done things differently, and like now, like, my future goal is to get set up so that I can have work visas in place to do more traveling and do clinics where people are coming to work with you for like a few days at a time, because there's a different level of expectation than if someone's sending their horse to you for like a month. Oftentimes people expect you to work freaking miracles in a month. They want their horse to be suddenly a different horse who goes from being completely out of shape to fully physically fit, that they can just get on and do whatever they want with after a month. And it's like, no matter how much of an angel your horse is, that is not realistic from a physical standpoint. Like, it's not realistic. And it just gets so tiresome. So when you're doing clinics, or if you're doing like online consults and stuff, there's this different level of expectation involved where people are expecting you to help them work through their issues, where they're there to learn skills that they can take to their horse to help them. And that is much more reasonable. The other thing that I really think is problematic about horse trainers today is that I find that they do not teach their clients to be self-sufficient. There's this mindset that you should need to take lessons week after week, all the time, forever, and that you shouldn't be fully self-sufficient, that you should be relying heavily on a trainer. And don't get me wrong, getting help from a trainer and seeking advice and seeking support and getting outside perspectives is important. But that doesn't need to look like having lessons in the traditional sense. It can be having colleagues that you contact and getting help and bouncing ideas off of them. It can be going to clinics, taking workshops, etc. I think that as a general rule, even clients that have no ambition to be horse trainers, like they should be more self-sufficient. Trainers should be teaching their students skills that allow them to work on problems and learn how to problem solve themselves. But that's not largely what's happening. Honestly, what I see happening a lot is that trainers will tell their students what to do in the moment, but there's not enough emphasis on why the horse is behaving in the way that they are, how to fix that, how to address these things, and how to have the skill sets to problem solve, determine why certain behaviors are coming about, and how to de-escalate problem behaviors, and how to teach certain things. A lot of trainers are not teaching their clients these things. And I think that whether they admit it or not, whether they're consciously aware of it or not, that there is a layer of that is about not wanting clients to be self-sufficient because then they don't need to take as many lessons. When I'm teaching lessons, as a general rule, it's like I pop in and I see a client like once a month or every now and then, and we go over things. I give them some advice on stuff to work on and how to work on it and give them like a shaping plan, and then they go on and they do their thing. And that's the same thing with like the online consults, is that it's about giving the people who book them a shaping plan to work on behavior for their horse and to be more self-sufficient and able to problem solve themselves, because the skills that they get in the long run are far more useful and beneficial when they have more skills to help themselves. And that is largely not what's happening in this industry, where it's like you're teaching people how to ride and how to ride through certain things, but you're not teaching them how to prevent certain behaviors in the first place. You're not teaching them how to problem solve. You're not teaching them why the horse is doing the things that they are. You're just teaching them like, oh, they just do that. That's just a part of the process. They're not learning skill sets on how to read and interpret horse behavior, which is a pretty freaking crucial part of being a rider and handling horses. And honestly, if they were taught how to do those things, it would help save so many people from really serious injuries or deaths if they knew, because it would give them at least a little bit of time before a big reaction where they would notice that something is going wrong and respond accordingly. But we're not teaching people those things. We're not teaching riders how to be self-sufficient. We're teaching people that things with horses are a lot more simple and less complex than they are. And then when you bring up the actual complexity of horse behavior and the nuance of certain behaviors and like how subtle stress and pain phase can be, people don't want to believe it because they've been spoon-fed this oversimplified idea of horse behavior. And that's not actually the way things are working. And then it's way harder to get through to people who've had this history of being taught these things in such an oversimplified manner. They don't want to be reached. They don't want to have to reflect on things differently, because the amount of work that you have to do to undo all of the prior conditioning is so much. And this is the problem with a lot of horse trainers too. And this is also why we see so much pushback against science-based training methods, because if they've not already started to adopt those, the idea of accepting the validity of them threatens their entire clientele. It threatens their entire livelihood, because they're usually attracting clients who want those quick fixes and who aren't being taught things in a science-based manner, obviously, because the trainer themselves isn't either. And they would have to uproot their entire practice and alter the entirety of how they go about doing things in order to make those changes. And that's a very scary thing to do. Speaking as someone who has done exactly that. It's difficult. It's scary. It's not super fun. And like naturally you do lose clients because they're going to go to trainers who promise them faster results. And honestly, in a lot of cases, they do achieve those results, but it's not with the horse's welfare in mind. And that's the key issue, is that if you actually start to look at welfare, it necessitates change in the way you go about doing things. But making those changes will lead people to discredit you. Like, I have people discrediting me all the time because they're like, oh, you don't even show, all you do is bop around your horses on the trails or like in the arena, you play with them at liberty. And they're oversimplifying what I'm doing. They're making a mockery of it, despite the fact that I'm doing things that they cannot do with their horses. And they're using it to suggest that I'm somehow less valid or qualified or talented of a trainer because I'm not pushing horses to work through stress to do these feats. But in my eyes, as a trainer, I think that it's a lot more of a failure as a trainer if you have a horse you can go to a show and jump a meter 60 course, but can't walk from its stall to its paddock without a chain over its nose, or can't trailer load properly without having a meltdown and needs to be forced on the trailer all the time, or could never even consider going on a trail because it would lose its fucking mind. Those horses have no nuance in their ability to be handled, and they can't even handle basic procedures. Like, how many show horses can people think of that need to be sedated or twitched to be clipped, despite the fact that they are clipped all the time for showing? So they have all of these holes in their training that aren't being used to label the trainer as a less qualified trainer, because people will be like, oh, that's just the way the horse is. Not all of them can be that way. And they make up all these excuses. But it's not viewed as a failure on the part of those trainers because they're using a different set of metrics to try to quantify their talent as a trainer. And it's like the same thing with using harsh bits and equipment. Like, if you can pilot your horse around a big course of jumps, but are doing so with like a huge steak knife in their mouth, people will not everyone, obviously, but a lot of people won't see an issue with that because they're getting what they want to have done. And they'll be like, oh, my horse is just really keen and just loves jumping so much that they're going to run through anything. And like, this can't be fixed. They maintain this mindset that this is not fixable. It's just the way the horse is. And it's literally just a mindset that they've decided, like it's like a dude, trust me narrative where there's nothing to support that notion other than the fact that they want to believe in. Because if they gave a trainer who took their time, the horse could learn how to go in less, but it would take a lot more time because there's that long-standing history of stress, especially with jumps. They would have to take the horse back to flat work for sure, probably back to groundwork, and then definitely restarting them over fences really slowly. So it would take a lot more time. And during the time that it would take to work on that, it would be viewed as like a failure of the trainer because the horse wouldn't be competing at the height that it usually did, which is very silly. It doesn't really make sense. And it's just an interesting narrative where there's all these things in place that are to protect the status quo of like how things have been brought along and to protect the elite. Because let's be for real, like if you're competing on the A circuit on any regular basis, even if you do it once a year, it's still like a $1,500 show, which is like, that's someone's rental cost, like that is someone's rent. So it's to protect the elite and the metrics that they're using to value themselves and justify what they're doing. And it happens at the expense of people who are trying to just make a difference. Yeah, if you're not part of the elite club that's doing this, then you are a potential threat to them, especially if you're talking about a different way of doing things that calls to question their tactics, and they're going to respond accordingly to make you feel alienated, to make you feel unworthy, and to make you feel like you're not as talented. It is a tactic that they're going to use to try to justify their own practices, whether they're consciously aware of that's why they're doing it or not. That's going to be the intent behind it. And it's a very toxic environment to be in, especially when you're starting out, especially when you're building up your clientele, and especially when you're building up your own self-esteem and sense of ability. And during that process, it's very easy to lose yourself in your desire to prove yourself to others because you don't have the internal wherewithal to be like, I know who I am. I know what I'm good at. I'm comfortable with my journey. You're seeking outside approval largely in the beginning stages of being a horse trainer. And it can be really a lonely place to be because you are trying to get the approval of people who will only give it to you if you essentially become one of them. There's so many people who had more respect for me when I was riding around on Milo and he was bronking after every jump and was like stopping. And like when I got him to slowly solve his refusal problem, but he was still bucking all the time and freaking out and just being stressed. They had more respect for my ability to ride through bucks like that than they do about my ability to prevent that from happening in the first place and to get him regulated enough where he's not doing that all the time. They don't respect the idea of like preventing those types of reactions, because if they never see the reaction happen, they don't believe that the horse ever had it in them, which is a shame because it should be viewed as more of a win from a training perspective to avoid that level of stress escalating to that extent in the first place than it should be to ride through it after you've already gotten a horse stressed to that point. And the thing is, shit happens. No matter how much you try to avoid things, you might have a moment where you've had an oversight, where you misinterpreted a behavior, where you've missed something, or where something so crazy happens that the horse just reacts. And that might happen. But when it's happening on a repeated basis and it's just like part of your brand as like a trainer, which it was for mine for a lot of years, that you can ride through shitty behaviors like that, then that's like where it becomes a problem, because that's a very toxic value system to get your value for yourself from. And it's also very telling because the amount of people that were super okay with my content back then but hate it now, it does speak for something. And it also is all related to like their own internal struggles. Like that's the thing, is as soon as you start to alter your own perspective and the way you go about things and be more authentic with yourself and call out the acts of inauthenticity that you've engaged in the past, people who aren't ready to self-reflect like that, but who have similarities to your journey are going to hate you because you are exposing in them some of those aspects of themselves that they wish to avoid. And I think that with my content online, I've done that with a lot of people. And I think that it also makes people highly uncomfortable when you have the self-respect and self-esteem to look at what you're good at, to know what you're good at, and to be honest with yourself about it and to not really defer to their value system. Like if someone tries to value me off of a show record now, I'm like, I don't care. Have fun wasting monthly rent money on a rated show. You know, like all of the training that you've done to get to that show is largely not at the show. So like the show is literally just essentially like a parade to show off what you've worked on. So it's really weird that show records in the first place are being used to label people's talent as trainers, because really all it speaks for is for their ability to spend money to show at those things, especially if they're showing their personal horses and not horses that clients are paying for. But it also speaks for the clientele you're appealing to. And like, that's also why I've stepped so far back from the show industry, because I found that that was where I was finding the most toxic clients who were impacting my value system and my morals and causing me to have to be in an environment that wasn't actually what I wanted to do. And not all the show people are like that. That's not to say that all of them encourage rushing or want to use harsh bits or what, but you're more likely to find a higher concentrated amount of those types of people than you are when you're just looking at people who are bringing along young horses or pleasure riding horses or trail horses, or who simply just want to learn how to exist with their horse in a more harmonious way. So that's kind of why I've like shifted my perspective as a trainer and why I've taken a bigger step back from doing like lots and lots of clients, because it was just like so toxic. It was hard on my body. It was hard on my mental health. I could never ride and enjoy my own horses. And like the way that we've set like the narrative of like what a horse trainer is, and just like that entire environment is like not the healthiest place to be in a lot of cases. Once you find like your group of people who share similar values, and you have your mentors and you have people that you can reach out to that you respect that have helped you along the way, it does get a lot better and it's healthier. But like the horse world is a really toxic place. Like I'm just going to be fully honest here, whether you're a trainer or not, there's a lot of really toxic and abusive behavior that is normalized towards both horses and humans. I personally think it's all connected. Like, I think that the reason why people are toxic to each other is because they're toxic to horses and vice versa. Like, it's a circular issue. because we've just created this environment where it's viewed as normal, and where like even people who see it and don't like it, like a certain level of apathy and not speaking out against it is normal, because if you do speak out against it and you're in a crowd of people who largely accept it, then you're suddenly going to become the target, and they're all going to mock and make fun of you and just be shitty to you. So it's very difficult. Like, it's not the healthiest environment to be in. And I think that we're learning more and more about like the degree of corruption and just like unhealthy thinking styles and patterns in the horse world, as we get more of these scandals coming out and just like stories of people either hurting horses or what they've done to hurt people. Like, there's just a lot of abusive tendencies and mindsets in the horse world that are normalized. And I think that it's something that we do need to look at, because whether you directly contribute, it's something that the industry as a whole has created, either through direct contribution of people or through people being willing to look the other way and be willing to like, not willing, but feeling compelled and like they need to alter their practices and like conform to a certain standard. Like, there's a lot of pressure to conform. And I think that's another thing with like, if you're going into training, that you do need to be prepared to stand your ground and not feel pressured to conform to other people's ideas. Like, being flexible enough to discuss different ways of doing things and being open to other ideas is important. But that doesn't mean that you have to be open to ideas that just seem unethical. It doesn't mean that you should have to fold and agree with people who are telling you to do things that aren't ethical just because they jump a meter 60 or show Grand Prix dressage, you know, because like none of that stuff requires any understanding of the horse's behavior or like care for their welfare currently. Like, it's not a mandated thing. You don't need any of that to do well at the upper levels. So those aren't people that I think people should role model simply because they are at the pinnacle of the sport. I think we should be choosing our role models based off of who is valuing the horse the most and who is actually speaking for the horse, because a good horse trainer should be serving as like a medium between the horse's interest and the human's interest, to find balance and harmony, and to also make it fair on both sides, and to try to help there be like connection and understanding between the two. Like, you're essentially serving as like an interpreter for the horse and an interpreter for the human towards the horse, so that they can learn how to make things more clear and easily understood by the horse. And that's really all it is. But that training has gotten so lost from that, to the point where it's about obedience and what you can make the horse do, no matter how that was achieved. And that's something that needs to change. So the nature of this industry makes it so that it's like a hard one to make a living in, you know, like it's hard to make a living off of being a horse trainer for a number of reasons, because the risk of injury is high. If you injure yourself, you're screwed. If you have no fallback option and you have like a long-term injury that you need to rest, you're screwed. So my recommendation for anyone interested in becoming a horse trainer would be to have other options, like start doing like online consults or something, some other remote style job that you can do in tandem with your everyday training job where you're going to clients, just in the event that you ever become injured. Also to like save money where you can, so that if something ever happens, that you're not screwed, because it's one of those things where it's like you're getting paid for like work as you do it, generally speaking. So if you're suddenly no longer able to physically do it, then it's going to really limit your ability to make an income. And the other thing too would be to take time to preserve your mental and physical health as well, and to be really rigid on not letting clients put you in positions that are going to injure you. Because for me, like, I've just gotten lucky that I'm not more hurt than I am. And even then, like, I know there's going to be stuff that I'm going to be discovering in years to come where I've like worn out my joints and stuff and have done things that are going to cause me long-term discomfort, that if I had done things differently in my earlier years, that it wouldn't have been an issue. So that sucks. So like, if this podcast can serve for anything, I hope is just to reaffirm the fact that the horse world is a very toxic place, that the pursuit of being a horse trainer is a difficult job, and it is an unforgiving job, and it's not one that comes easily, and there's a lot of challenges mentally and physically that are involved with it. So I'm hoping that that helps people feel more heard. This isn't to say that, like, I know the title is why you shouldn't be a horse trainer, but I don't actually mean that, because we need good ones out there. But I just think that, I guess the main takeaway is like the traditional outlook of what a horse trainer is needs to shift, and that there's a lot of really unhealthy norms that are perpetuated on horse trainers that we really need to alter and do a better job of denormalizing, so that we don't create such a toxic environment in the future, because I would really like to see a shift, because even the trainer-student dynamic at a lot of barns is not okay. Like there's a lot of bullying towards students and whatnot in the name of training as well. And like even like adult trainers towards child students and whatnot. Like a lot of people who've grown up riding can attest to having that experience too. And that's something that really needs to shift as well, because that's not normal either. It's not a normal dynamic to normalize abuse by calling it tough love, and like being verbally abused is not a prerequisite for being a good rider. In fact, it's damaging, if anything. And I think that also feeds into a lot of the weird self-destructive mindsets that we see in the horse world, is because of that dynamic where people have been growing up being completely berated by trainers and just made to feel like garbage and made to feel super insecure. And it also increases the level of dependency that they experience towards their trainers, where they feel like they owe their, like that they can only do the right thing when their trainer's there watching, and that they need constant supervision, and where they don't really have confidence in their own ability to problem solve and make decisions. And that's also a problem. So yeah, it's hard. If you want to become a horse trainer, I would just recommend acknowledging the fact that just because you're going after something you love doesn't mean that it's not going to feel like work, because it will. And to also understand that like training horses is not just working with animals. You're going to need to figure out ways to communicate to people, and to also set boundaries that might be uncomfortable to set. And it's not always going to be butterflies and rainbows. It can be very difficult, and it can be very thankless, and it can end up being something where you realize, hey, this is actually not what I want to do, because it's damaging my perception of horses. I still love training and I still love helping people, but my approach of it has changed drastically, just because like the initial goal I had of being like one of those horse show style trainers who's starting and producing young horses and going to shows and has lots of clients, like that's the most exhausting and like crappy way of like being around horses. And I learned that the hard way, and it really almost robbed me of my love for horses and like working with my own horses. So yeah, just something to consider. Be careful out there. Don't forget to advocate for yourself. And I know that there's a happy medium between like communicating with clients in a way and like finding compromise so that you can afford to live your life and that you're not just losing clients, but also staying like aligned with like your values and understanding of your worth, and not selling out and losing yourself in the process of a career, because no career is worth that. So yeah, I guess that's my TED talk for the day. Thank you for listening. Sorry, this one's going to be kind of messy and like all over the place. My dog barked like 3 times while I was recording, and that was very annoying. But I hope the audio is better. So like definitely let me know, because I got a new microphone that I'm very excited about. It sounds better to me, but like I'm interested to hear from people who've listened to my other podcasts where I'm recording on a way crappier mic, and what you guys think. So that would be awesome if you could let me know. And yeah, I'll be hopefully back next week with another podcast. I'm going to try to pre-record in Q1. I'm recording this one the morning of because I didn't have time to last night. And then I'm away this weekend for my friend's wedding. But I'll be back during the week again. And then we'll get another topic up and maybe post something for like topic ideas if people are interested. So thanks for listening. Thank you so much for tuning into the Making Milestones podcast this week. If you are interested in ways that you can help support the podcast, it would be greatly appreciated if you would leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews help to promote the podcast in the algorithm, allowing me to connect with new listeners, and it is so greatly appreciated. Some other ways you can help to support the podcast include subscribing to my Patreon channel, where you can subscribe for as little as $1 a month and access monthly Q&As, behind-the-scenes content, training help, and more. Every subscription helps, and they help to offset any costs associated with the podcast, allowing me to keep most of these episodes ad-free. I also have an online store where I sell equestrian athletic apparel, graphic t-shirt and hoodie designs, horse bridles, both bitted and bitless, and you can check that out in the podcast description as well. Lastly, I have my main website where I have a bunch of webinars with different types of training topics, and where I also offer online training consultations if you want a one-on-one appointment with me. All of this helps me continue doing what I'm doing, and your support is so appreciated.